report at the National Public Radio on the question of Confucianism in the modern times. And it's a fascinating question that for the last 6 to 7 years, there's an upsurge of interest in the Confucian tradition. And it's difficult to gauge what is the reason for that particular interest. But it's easy to argue that the tradition may have been one of the longest, perhaps most influential, humanistic and spiritual traditions in the world. In 1948, German philosopher Karl Jaspers talked about 4 paradigmatic personalities in the world. And he identified Socrates, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, and also Confucius. But in the last 100 years or so, Confucianism was somehow marginalized in China. We may have a chance to discuss that. But the purpose of this course is to offer you a basic idea about Confucian ethics. The basic idea is focused on the question of learning to be human. If you have to define what Confucian humanism is about, its purpose is learning to be human, broadly defined. And Confucius made it rather explicit that learning to be human is a form of learning for the sake of the self. For the sake of the self, meaning it is not devoted to learning for society, for instructions from one's parents, for government, or even to serve others. So this may be surprising to many of you because normally we consider Confucian ethics as a form of social ethics. The reason the focus is on learning for the sake of the self is the idea of character building. Learning is not the acquisition of knowledge alone. Learning is not necessarily the internalization of certain kind of skills that we'll be able to use for our career. Learning is character building. It's trying to learn to be human in a very broad sense, in the broad sense of being able to fully realize the potential of one's ability, not only for self-understanding, but for interacting with other human beings, or for social service, or for government service. So the paradox is that we learn for ourselves, but the primary concern of learning for ourselves is not simply to enhance our individualistic qualities, but also to be able to relate meaningfully to others. Because the self in the Confucian tradition is always understood as a center of relationships rather than an isolated individual. As a center of relationships, the focus is on the center first, the autonomy, independence, and dignity of the person. But that person is not an isolated individual. Therefore, it is important also to try to learn from others. And the idea that you learn from others through a process of expansion. You learn from people who are closest to you, your family members, then to the neighborhood, to the community, and beyond. So learning for the sake of the self is to build one's character. And to build one's character is to focus on the self as a center of relationships. And this interplay between the self, we call it self-cultivation, and social service is the purpose of this particular course. That's one of the reasons in the description we emphasize the importance of self-cultivation and society as a community of trust, and also beyond. And in this particular context, Confucian humanism is a very long process of human development, not simply the development of economy and politics. And for you to be interested in this cause, I think it's important to attend a lecture, to take part in the discussion groups. The discussion groups will be relatively small for a great deal of interaction. And also to prepare 3 very short papers in addition to the final exam. Now, first of all, do you have any questions about the mechanism of this particular course? If you don't have any questions, let me give you a glimpse of the issues involved that I'd like to pursue. First, we can talk about the Confucian tradition as a transtemporal process. In other words, as one of the oldest traditions in human history, continuous tradition. It began certainly at the time of Confucius. He was born in 551 BC. And people actually identify the specific date, September 28. So that was considered as the beginning. But it's somehow misleading because Confucius, unlike Buddha or Christ, was not the founder of Confucianism. Confucius, in fact, was a transmitter. So the tradition prior to Confucius' birth in 551 BC had already existed for centuries. So in this sense, that is transtemporal. I try to divide this process of Confucianism in terms of 3 major epochs. From a very small local culture to become the mainstream of Chinese civilization, the first epoch, roughly from 6th century BC to 3rd century AD. The second epoch is from roughly 11th century until the 19th century, when the tradition spread beyond China to become part of Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. That's one of the reasons Confucian tradition has been characterized as a manifestation of East Asian spirituality. Then since 19th century, because of the impact of the West, we're now talking about the possibility of a 3rd epoch. Now, in this period, that Confucianism hopefully will move beyond East Asia and become part of the global community. So this is the major 3 epochs. In this sense, the tradition is also cross-cultural. Many of us just assume that a tradition is part of Chinese culture. This is right, because there are many, many other spiritual resources in Chinese culture, such as Taoism, such as Buddhism. But Confucianism also flows beyond Chinese culture. No matter how you broaden the scope of Chinese culture, you cannot accommodate the tradition, because it's also Vietnamese, also Korean, also Japanese. And it's one of those important traditions in humanistic and spiritual sense, which is radically different from what we are familiar with in terms of the modern Western idea. The modern Western idea normally has been shaped by 2 very powerful forces: the Greek tradition on the one hand and the Judaic tradition on the other. Confucianism, like Hinduism, like Buddhism, like Zoroastrianism, outside of the consciousness of the modern West. And this tradition has its own distinctive features. Let me give you one example. You're all familiar with some of the core values in the modern West. We try to spread these core